Another session for the ESA. At this time, we will take a look at the command line. I would like to go over some more important CLI statements, configuration statements, and discuss their syntax and also purpose. Okay, ESA, same as WSA, runs on top of what is known as async OS, which is actually a hardened version of one of the Linux distributions. In this case, the command line shell is going to be very similar, or at least somewhat similar, I should say, to the iOS CLI, especially in terms of things like command completion, maybe process termination, context-sensitive help. So stuff like tab, Control-C, Control-Z, question mark, you will be able to use them on the ESA as well. What is going to be different is that most of the configuration commands, they will take the so-called interactive mode approach. The actual config is going to be provided by answering a series of questions, or at least by selecting individual settings using digits, or each of the digits is going to correspond to one of the specific menu options. So certain settings of the ESA, certain commands, they will have a similar syntax to what you could also see on the iOS for those interactive based commands, like for example auto secure or maybe setup. It's more of like the question and answer approach, or basically choose an option from the menu, that type of configuration style. Okay, now what is going to be different from the iOS, at least a regular iOS, is that there is going to be no global configuration mode, but anytime you will issue a configuration statement. In order for the changes to take effect, you will first have to commit them. So it's very similar to what you see on XR, a type of iOS. Like if you guys had the chance to work with those ASR 9K platforms, for instance, those run on top of iOS XR and it uses the same exact approach. Okay, another thing I wanted to discuss is going to be command line commands, at least to show you more important configuration syntax. So for basic initial setup, or just basic config of the ESA, some of the basic settings, you would definitely want to take a look at ifrconfig, which is what you can use to define some basic layer 1, layer 2 settings. Stuff like duplex, speed, and also VLANs, where VLANs are going to be important if you plan to use sub-interfaces. So when you want to use build multiple virtual port out of a single physical interface of the ESA. So something that you could also do on the WSA, first thing you have to define your VLANs, and then you have to use the interface config command to bind them to an IP address and all other important required layer 3 interface settings, like mask, maybe management settings, and so on. So this command is also used to configure some of the management settings on a port. Okay, next is route config, which is how you will add configure static routes, all except for the default route, because the default route is configured using a different command. In static routes, this is talking about anything which is at least /1 or more, up to /32, versus at gateway, and this is for a default route which is always /0. NTP config, this is what we will use to provide information about our NTP server or servers. DNS, this is going to be one of the most critical pre-configuration, I would say, components, or just initial configuration components that you have to define on the ESA. One way to do it is going to be to use the DNS config, and the other one is going to be to provide IP addresses of DNS servers, or at least choose root servers during the initial setup wizard. Whenever you want to change those options, no matter if you initialize the ESA via CLI or GUI, you will always have a chance to change those settings, in most cases on the GUI, in certain cases on the CLI. Okay, DNS flash, something you would issue if your DNS config changed and you assume you expect some entries to be corrupted. This is how you will clear the ESA's DNS cache. So same as WSA, ESA caches DNS information to cut down on the lookups. This is important, especially that email security appliance is typically performing about, I believe, 4 separate DNS checks on every single connection. You will have 2 lookups, reverse and forward, to check the sender, and I believe some lookups will be also associated with so-called sender-based reputation score. So this is why DNS cache is automatically used. This is how you can flush it. Okay, NS lookup or dig, this is how you will perform basic DNS verification. NS lookup, this is what I would use for really basic sanity checks, like if resolution works with my default DNS server. If I'm looking to choose a specific DNS server, I would use dig. When you say add and specify IP address, this is IP address of a DNS server that you want to use for this particular resolution. Like maybe you use different DNS servers, internal DNS servers for different internal domains. In this case, this option will be pretty handy. We also have some commands that you normally use for verification and basic troubleshooting, like ping, traceroute, and telnet. So those are still available on the ESA. A tail, this is very important command. This is how you will access ESA logs. You can say tail and specify name of the log you want to open, or you can just say tail, press the enter key, and it is going to give you a list of all the types of logs supported by the appliance, and then you will be able to choose a given log by referring to its number. Packet capture, this is TCP dump utility built into the ESA, and we also have malconfig. This command is useful if you want to test ESA's email sending capabilities. Like you initialized ESA for the first time, you configured IP address of an internal SMTP server, and you want to see if ESA is capable of sending emails to this internal email appliance. Okay, some other commands useful for verification. We've got status with an optional detail option to take a look at basic performance related settings, stuff like uptime, CPU utilization, maybe licensing. Plus, this command is also gonna give you information about certain events, like the number of soft hard bounces, rejected recipients. The actual syntax and what it means, you can look it up in the doc.cd. Okay, another one is gonna be host status, which is gonna display you a similar thing, but on a recipient host basis. The top end, this is what you would issue to take a look at large volume senders to quickly identify them. A trace, this is something that you can also run using the GUI. This is basically an equivalent of the ASA's packet tracer command. It is going to show you how a virtual message coming from a virtual sender destined to possibly a virtual recipient would be actually processed by the ESA, including all policy engines that would be involved in this processing. Then you can also say diagnostic, choose the network option, and then SMTP ping, which is how you can quickly test SMTP connectivity to remote SMTP servers. The status of a listener on those.